All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're glad you could join us for our fourth and final of a series of trainings and informational presentations on multifamily housing in Wisconsin. My name is Russell Caney, President and Board Member of YCAR. This series was organized and presented by YCAR, the Wisconsin Council for Affordable and Rural Housing of Wisconsin. YCAR was established in 1997 with the goal of providing education, advocacy, and collaboration between our members who represent owners, managers, and related parties, with funders and other resources available to the multifamily industry, particularly with rural development at USDA. As many of you know, YCAR traditionally has a fall annual conference, typically held in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. For 2020 and 2021, we elected to postpone our conference as a precautionary measure during the pandemic. We have scheduled the same venue for 2022 and look forward to seeing many of you next year in person. Please note that our previous presentations were recorded and are available on the YCAR website. Before I introduce our special guests for this session titled Recapitalization and Rehab of Your Properties, I want to acknowledge our sponsors. You are provided material on each sponsor along with contact information for each. These sponsors help defray the cost of these events. Please consider their services in the future. They are ARMA Insurance Program, Bear Insurance Services Incorporated, Sinair, Sid Grinker Restoration Incorporated, Simply Computer Software Incorporated, Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority, WHEDA, Wisconsin Management Company, and finally Hirsch Group Architecture. I will remind you that using the Zoom platform, everyone in the audience has been muted to allow our speakers to present uninterrupted. However, we want and encourage questions, comments during the session and after. If you are familiar with Zoom, there's a chat box at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your question. We will monitor this during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will also unmute everyone to allow direct questions. And again, this session is being recorded for later viewing. All these logistics are being handled by Diane Ham, our administrator at YCAR. Thank you, Diane, for all your work in getting us up to date on all the sessions. Now, on with our presentation for today. Our guests and speakers today are Joe Schwenker and John Bragg. Joe and John have extensive experience in the development and rehab of multifamily properties, including rural development 515 units. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Joe and John.
Well, thanks, Russ. I think that's the first time I've ever been called a special guest. I've been called a few other things. Welcome, everybody, to case studies in recent acquisitions and rehabs. We're going to focus on Section 515 throughout this presentation. But before we do that, a little bit about Wisconsin Management Company. Next slide, please. So we've, as the name implies, we manage property. We manage over 6,000 units in a three-state area: Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. Been in business for over 40 years, a mix of market rate and affordable. We have experience with probably every type of program number and acronym you can imagine. We're vertically integrated. We own, we manage, we invest, we consult, and we construct. Next slide, please. When it comes to construction, we have a subsidiary called FGS, and like Wisconsin Management, it's been in business for over 40 years. We construct and rehab primarily multifamily properties, both for our own account and for third parties. We're wrapping up 2 projects right now where we're rehabbing for, both of them are nonprofits that are owned. We do residential and commercial restoration. We do a ton of insurance business. And if there's a disaster that you can imagine, we probably cleaned it up. Next slide, please. Just a quick picture of our ownership, which is on the top right hand, is Russ Endress, who is our president, and Alicia Reed, who is his daughter. And the bottom left is a picture of Craig Ballback, who's our GM of FGS. Next slide. We probably don't need to go into our bios, as Russ had indicated. Both John and I have a fair amount of gray hair, and we've seen a lot of things during our career. Next slide, please. The focus of the presentation is rural development 515s. And before we get into the case studies, we thought it might be insightful to talk a little bit about the program. In many communities, the 515 property is the only housing for lower income people. And in some cases, it's the highest quality housing. 87% of the counties in the country have at least one 515. The average income, as probably all of you know, is extremely low. It's $13,500. And for those households with RA, it's only $11,300. 2/3 of the residents are elderly and disabled. And what we're facing right now is the challenge of aging properties. A lot of these properties were built over 40 years ago, and the capital just hasn't been available to maintain those properties. In addition to that, we're facing aging ownership. Much like the properties, the owners that built the property 40 years ago, or the nonprofit who established the entity to own these properties, these folks are aging out as well as the physical asset. The properties are typically smaller in size, and there's typically in smaller markets. So that means there's inherently increased risk. And then finally, there are limited resources to rehab this aging housing stock. And we'll get into a couple of case studies following this. Next slide, please. I found this slide, and this was a webinar that Russ Caney's prior employer, Enterprise, put out about a month ago. And I just found it insightful to look at the distribution of 515 properties and how they are primarily in the eastern half of the United States. And if you follow the Mississippi River up from the Gulf of Mexico to Minnesota, you can kind of track where the 515s are located. Next slide. The dispersion of multifamily property exits somewhat follows the dispersion of assets. However, it's really concentrated in the upper Midwest. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, South Dakota, these states have seen a tremendous amount of property exits in the 5-year period from 2016 to 2021. Whether that continues or not probably is going to be a function of how the program is ultimately going to be funded. Next slide. There's a song from I believe it was the early 90s, and I won't sing it, but it was by The Clash, and it was, "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" And I think a lot of property owners, whether they're individuals or their nonprofit organizations, are facing that same question. If somebody elects to stay, there's, like I said earlier, limited resources for rehab. There may be declining occupancy, and that could be a function of demographics, or it could be a function of poor curb appeal on the part of the asset. There could be tax implications. And finally, there's the ability and desire, really, to manage and continue to own properties. We had an individual where we purchased a property in July. He was 85 years old. He's a widower. He moved to Florida about 10 years ago. He had a property in Wisconsin, which we purchased, and he was done being an owner. So should you decide to go, There's a couple of options. There's an outright sale. And if you choose the right buyer, that buyer should have experience with the rural development program. It's a lot of nuance and it's quite complicated. You could also joint venture. Again, you need to pick the right partner, or you could self-perform. You could try to do a rehab on your own, but you need to recognize that there is a extensive commitment of both time and expertise, and you will have to provide a guarantee. One thing that can help you through that process is if you hire a consultant. As I indicated earlier, Wisconsin Management also does consulting. Next slide, please. There are really 4 potential sources of rehab funds. And I mentioned acronyms earlier, and if somebody could kick me under the table if I start using acronyms, please do so. The biggest source is a state housing finance agency. In Wisconsin's case, that's WHEDA, Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. They allocate tax credits. Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, FHLBC, does the Affordable Housing Program, which is AHP. We're all familiar with rural development, RD. And then finally, there's home funds, and those home funds are administered by HUD. I'm guessing that everybody knows the HUD acronym. Next slide. Start first with tax credits, and we'll get into some case studies on these. Tax credits provide the most robust rehab, and it's really the only way to financially work a full rehab. It's complicated, it's competitive. In Wisconsin, there's probably $3 of ask for every dollar of credit that's available. You need to coordinate with your lender, with WHEDA, with RD, with the investor. You get to apply one time per year. The upfront cost is about $30,000, and that's for third-party reports, and you might have to engage an architect to draw up some plans and specs so you know what your scope of work is, and then your ultimate construction costs. If you do this, you'll enter into a LURA, a land use restriction agreement, which means the property is going to remain affordable for the next 30 years. There are nuances with the RD program regarding restrictions on return to owner, RTO, proceeds of sale, and a plethora of other things that one needs to understand and make sure that RD's restrictions mesh with WHEDA's tax credit restrictions. The tax credit exit strategy is pretty popular. There's over 500 tax credit applications nationally in the RD queue right now. And I know we have 2 of those 500, and we're working with RD to close those deals. And we closed one of them, the deal I mentioned earlier with the 85-year-old former owner, in July. One thing to consider, and this is a plug for YCAR, is to use the YCAR lease, because there are certain provisions in that lease that will make things much easier when it comes to actually transferring the property. Next slide, please. Kind of a flow chart of the development process. And it's a long process. If you jump to the bottom, it's 2 years from inception to completion. And let's say in Wisconsin, we started doing our due diligence in August. So we're getting understanding our loan amount. We're looking at a scope of work for rehab. We're doing a market study, either internally or with a third party, to look at how the market compares to how the CERCU rents, which is comparable rent, comparable unit, compare to what's existing at the property. And if the CERCUs are higher, that gives you the opportunity to drive more first mortgage proceeds. You take what you learned in the first step and you create a pro forma. Then you go on to WHEDA scoring, and the WHEDA scoring process is complicated. It's driven by a number of factors, including locational factors. Are you in a high-performing school district? Are you close to a grocery store? Are you close to job centers? And a lot of this is driven by census tract. And as I said earlier, it's competitive. So you have to evaluate where your potential score is versus where you think the cutoff is. So that gets you to October, and a go, no go decision. Let's say you decide we're going to put a tax credit application in. That means in October, November, you're putting the app together and you're getting your third-party reports, which are appraisal, market study, and capital needs assessment. Your application is due in December of that year. WIDA will sift and winnow through the applications from December to April. They'll make an award. From April to October, you're getting your ducks in a row. That is with RD, that's with WIDA, that's with your tax credit investor. And if there's any other funding in the capital stack, you have to make sure that everything aligns. So you close in October, you start construction in November. Let's say it's a typical construction schedule. It's less than a year. That means your construction completion is in July of 2 years from inception of this. It's really a long and lengthy process and complicated. And this flow chart is in no means to be detailed. This is really a 30,000 foot flyover view of it. Next slide, please. We mentioned Affordable Housing Program, AHP. Both AHP and home can be used with the LIHTC structure, or they can be used alone, but they don't give you nearly the amount of rehab. We're really talking about maybe $30,000 per unit. Both of them are competitive. Both of them typically are a one-time per year application, similar to LIHTC. There is one difference in that AHP is a quote unquote forgivable loan. It's really basically structured as a grant. Whereas home funds typically are a loan that could be low interest, it could be cash flow, but at the end of the loan term, they're expected to be paid back. Again, you can combine these with tax credits. You can possibly do them on their own, but they have their own nuances. Next slide, please. Rural development. I won't go over this because Larry Anderson in the previous presentation did a fantastic job, and he's the RD whisperer. We have a HUD whisperer that understands all the nuance, but I will highlight some of the bullet points at the bottom. There are some provisions in the DASH Act. DASH is decent, affordable, safe housing that do impact the rural development program. One of the really unique ones is a basis boost for rural properties, where instead of getting a dollar for dollar credit, a rural property might get $1.30. That's extremely powerful leverage, and that could really help to fill in some of the funding gaps. They're also looking at additional 515 funding. They're looking at pooling rental assistance. They're looking at doing something similar to what HUD did with their RAD program, which is kind of moving. It's extremely complicated if that happens. We'll certainly be monitoring that. And then the last point is to align with the housing finance agencies. And that's a critical one, because the RD program sometimes doesn't fit with the tax credit program from a programmatic perspective, as well as from a timing perspective. So if we can get the programs to align, it's going to be a much more powerful execution. I'm going to quit talking now and turn it over to my colleague, John Bragg, who's been patiently listening to me. And John's going to talk some of the specifics on construction. Take it away, John.
All right, thanks, Joe. Next slide, please, Patty. So we're going to talk about several projects, 3 that we have going on right now. Fall River Meadows, which is 24 units, 2 buildings, and this one has both tax credits and some RD money in it. Parkview Apartments, which we're doing for a different owner. So only some RD money, and then Cuba City Apartments, which again is multi-funded. Next slide, Maddie. So we're going to talk a lot about relocation of the residents and their homes. We'll go through some of the resident coordination that we do in some detail, how I go about scheduling those things. We'll talk about transition units, hotel and family. When we go to move our tenants, it depends on the property, whether we have what we call a transition unit. A transition unit would be if we have some vacant apartments at the facility that we're going to remodel. We'll remodel those first, and then we'll furnish those so that as we do the other tenants' apartments, they have a place to go and stay right on site while we do the remodel. In some cases, that's not possible, so we have to put them up in a hotel. And then other cases, people have family local that they would rather go stay with the family. And in that case, we allow them to do that. Cost-wise, if we use a transition unit, we average that out to about $2,500 per unit to utilize that source. If we have to put them in a hotel, it's about $3,500 a unit. And if we put them up with family, it's about $4,500 a unit. The other thing we really need to be concerned about in today's world is the pandemic and COVID-19. In many cases, we have to make some restrictions on the construction site to meet up with whatever the local rules are, and at the very least, follow the CDC guidelines that are in place. Pods, we have a picture in the lower right of some storage pods out in the parking lot. That is certainly one way you can store both materials and the tenant's property while we're in their units. The other option is to get some local storage units to move things into. And then the totes, those are the blue totes in the picture in the upper right. We have decided to purchase those totes. They're a very heavy plastic, and it's easily stackable, easy to put labels on to pack our tenants' smaller belongings into and store while we're remodeling their unit. Next slide, Maddie. So to kick things off and try and keep things off to a good start with our residents, we have a tenant meeting and we give them a letter that they can take back with them to reference to because they won't remember everything. And the one thing we really try and keep in mind here is that this is a difficult situation for our tenants. Moving them out of their unit for 3 or 4 weeks and then moving them back is difficult on them. So we try and put their minds at ease a little bit. I can tell you that when I go into these meetings, there are a lot of preconceived notions as to what we're going to do for construction. Maybe we're going to put an elevator in a 1-story building or a swimming pool in the courtyard, but those are exaggerations, but there are a lot of rumors out there. So when we give them this letter, we sit down and explain to them that the construction is going to begin. We give them an estimated timeline for the construction. We also let them know approximately how long they're going to be out of their unit. We'll get into the totes and the packing and the rules for that. And the way we do it is if you don't have a medical clearance that says you can't pack, we do intend to have our tenants pack their own smaller things into totes. Again, if they're physically not able, we do provide people to do that. We get totes to them 2 to 3 weeks prior to the construction of their unit so they can get things packed up. We'll label those things and move them to a storage on their designated move date and then bring them back. We put the larger furniture back where it belongs, put the totes in the appropriate rooms for how they're labeled, and then they need to unpack those, get the totes back to us fairly quickly because their neighbors are going to need those totes as well. We talk to them about where they're relocating to and why, so that they understand that it's going to be a transition unit right on the property or a local hotel, or in some cases, some of the residents request to go stay with family, and we have no issues with that. Timeline is very important. We can't have tenants out of their units more than 28 days. That's a compliance issue. So none of our scheduled turns are more than 4 weeks. We do stress to the tenants, there are no changes to the construction. As far as schedule or materials, things are pretty well set up at that point. And then we turn it over to our property managers to go over recertification and any rent increases that might be happening, and then do questions and answers with our tenants. If we do all this right, next slide, Maddie. Then we get things like this from our residents. This resident said, finally, a place to call my home. So we do get a few of those that are written to us, but we get many, many verbal compliments once we're finished, as hard as it all was up front to get things going. Next slide, Maddie. So this is just an example of a typical schedule. It's either 3 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on if we have holidays or if we have more work to do, like if we're configuring ADA units. So this is just a typical example of how we do it. And it's always 3 to 4 weeks, and we do 4 to 6 units per every turn. Next slide, Maddie. Relocation costs, we talked a little bit about how much it costs per unit to relocate, transition unit, hotel, and family. But other things you need to consider in there is if you're doing transition units, you have to have TV and internet for those folks in those rooms. So there's a cost there. There's a cost for cleaning those transition units in between turns. And then there's a cost for the storage units to store the tenant's belongings in. And then obviously we're going to have costs for movers. We elect to hire our own movers and do that. And then there's a truck and trailer rental to get the items moved. And there's packing materials, bubble wrap, paper, boxes, etc. Next slide, Maddie. So our rehabs, we coordinate with the superintendent, project manager, the residents, and the subcontractors. We send out that schedule along with a subcontractor agreement to all the subcontractors. We send a moving schedule to the residents. We do that through the property managers because the tenants already have that long-standing relationship with the property managers. The draw process, this can be long and drawn out, but we have come up with a schedule that we have invoices turned in, and 35 days later, it has gone through the entire process and checks are cut to the subs. We talked about limiting the time out of the unit. That's 28 days per rural development is the max. Plans and specs, you'll need to work with an architect to come up with some good plans, specifications, and a scope of work, which if you don't have that, nothing's going to go right.
Hey, John, if I could interject a little bit.
Go ahead, Joe.
One thing that we've learned, that even if we have existing plans and specs for a building, that if you don't field measure everything, it's probably going to turn out wrong.
Yeah, there are no true as-built out there. So choose your general contractor wisely, and understand that WIDA and RD do cap your general contractor fees. Preferred products, that really goes along with the plans and specs. Do your homework. Make sure you know what quality products you want to have in your build, and make sure they are part of those plans. A couple of things we've run into that we just want to caution a few people about. There are a lot of Federal Pacific circuit breaker panels in these units. Those should definitely be replaced as a matter of safety. When you're designing your ADA units, make sure that they comply. Again, not all the plans that you get will be correct, and make sure the measurements are right. So again, if we do all this right, there's a benefit to both the resident and the owner. To the resident, they get a new, clean, up-to-date apartment. And to the owner, they have an apartment complex that people want to come and move in. So if there was an issue with having the vacancy, that has gone away at the properties we've done. The other thing we've tried to focus on, because most of these units we do are elderly and disabled, is to have more accessibility. So we try on every project to have a washer dryer on each floor. And then we make sure that the parking lots meet the current ADA codes, because most of these buildings, when they were built, the parking lots in a lot of cases are sloped and don't meet those codes. And when we're done, we have the enhanced curb appeal to compete in the market. And we'll show some before and after pictures of some of our properties that will attest to that. And finally, lower utility costs through new insulation, new windows, LED lighting, new appliances. It all helps, and we get a lot of compliments from residents when we're finished that their electric bill has gone down substantially. Next slide, Maddie. So here's one case study. It's Parkview Apartments in Cambria, Wisconsin. It's a nonprofit retained ownership. We're dealing with just NPR for our source. We were adding some ADA units, a parking lot, and laundry to this facility. And this one's getting ready to come to a close. Next slide, Maddie. So on the left, there's the before picture, some pretty old decks, a pretty tired entryway coming into the building. To the right, this was 2 days ago. We were pouring the last of the concrete and finishing up some trim work, but you can see that the building's much more attractive. We are still waiting on some windows and doors to go in here that'll make it even more appealing. Next slide, Maddie. So inside the apartment, this is the ADA unit we created, and you can see that the bathroom prior was pretty small. We knocked down a lot of walls, expanded, and made an ADA accessible bathroom with all new appliances and LED lighting, a wheel-in shower with a bench, and everything up to ADA code, LVP flooring throughout the apartment except in the bedroom where it's carpeted. Next slide, Maddie. And here's the community kitchen before and after. A pretty big mess before, really wasn't used. After, new lighting, new cabinets, new appliances, LVP flooring, very attractive at this point. And tenants say they'll be happy to use it now. Next slide, Maddie. Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about this.
Thanks, John. Unlike Parkview, Sunrise Valley, which is a very large RD property, 102 units, this one's got a more typical capital stack. We refer to it as lasagna financing because there are a variety of layers of this, tax credits, rural development, AHP, TIF, I'm going on with acronyms, WIDA debt, deferred developer fee. Next slide, Maddie. These slides will be available. I'm not asking people to go line item by line item, but if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the lion's share of the capital stack was made up through tax credit equity. And this equity was provided by Sinair. We've done 5 deals with Sinair. They've been a tremendous partner. Further down on the capital stack is the assumption of rural development loans. And we work closely with rural development, both nationally and locally, on this project locally to close the deal. AHP, which we discussed earlier, is in for $745,000. We got a TIF loan from the city. This was not a TIF grant per se. It was a TIF loan, a PAYGO TIF. And then WIDA provided first mortgage financing, RD subordinated to WIDA. And WIDA has been a great partner both in allocating the tax credits as well as providing the debt. So the highlight here is the lion's share of the capital stack is made up by tax credit equity, but there's a whole bunch of other sources, and we have to make sure that all those sources mesh together to work at closing. Call your attention to the lower right-hand corner of the slide. Developer fee, which again is a benefit to the owner / developer. That's significant in this project. It's a large project, over $1 million. And then also you get to fund all of your reserves. So we've got over $500,000 of reserves for this property, and that's enough to keep it functioning very well throughout the 15-year tax credit compliance period. Next slide, Maddie, and I'll turn it over to John, who knows this project like the back of his hand.
Yeah, so this particular project, we have a community room in every building, and the picture to the left is the community room in one of the buildings that the ADRC used as the meal site for the city of Lancaster. So people came in here to have their lunches, and then they packed up lunches and have volunteers that deliver these to people in the city. So you can see from the picture on the left, not a very attractive or appealing room. The picture on the right shows that we removed some apartments from above and created a 2-story atrium style room that now serves as our ADRC meal site. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit about the same time we finished, so they don't have on-site meals there anymore, but they still do pack up and deliver the meals from there. Hopefully that'll be back open again soon. Next slide, Maddie.
Hey, John, just to go back on that slide, the original ADRC room was straight out of the 70s. It actually had shag carpeting on the walls, and you can see how much brighter and cleaner the new facility is and how the residents love it.
Yeah, so the picture to the left, this is the same room from an opposite shot. So you can see the kitchen at the far end now. You can barely see that we did put in commercial refrigerator and freezers on the left. They're stainless steel. The small refrigerator straight ahead is for tenants that live in that building that want to utilize that room. The picture on the right, laundry room. We talked about putting a laundry room on every floor. This is a laundry room on this particular building's floor. Again, you can see the LVP flooring in there, bright, clean, everything really is nice at the end. Next slide, Maddie. So here are some unit pictures of the same site. The living room on the left, we added ceiling fans and lights to every unit in the living room and in the bedrooms. Previously, the light switch turned on one of the outlets in the room to turn on a lamp. LVP flooring, for the most part, white trim and light gray walls. And then we have a mini split up on the wall. We added a mini split to every unit here that also has a heat pump built in, which when we talked about energy savings, this is a huge energy savings over the previous heating system, which was in ceiling heat, coils built into the drywall. And then we used to take one of the small windows in that living room window, put a window air conditioner in there. So not only would you lose light, but you'd have a pretty noisy air conditioning unit. These new ones are quiet. The kitchen, all maple cabinets, soft closed doors and drawers, all wood construction, LVP flooring, new appliances. A dishwasher was added to every unit. Pull down sprayer in the kitchen sink, which is always a big hit for the elderly. And then in the bathroom, a matching maple cabinet in there. Toilets are all the ADA height and elongated bowls. And then we reglazed all the tub shower surrounds to a nice bright white so it fits in with the rest of the apartment. Next slide, Maddie. So we have some testimonials from Sunrise that we'd like to play for you. And so here's one from some tenants there.
I like the kitchen, I like the bathroom, I like the entire apartment and the balcony.
I love my dishwasher, so I don't have to get a dishwasher. I love the handheld shower, the floors. Yeah.
Okay, so here's Rural Development's testimonial.
With our many stakeholders throughout the state of Wisconsin to try and leverage our resources. The Lancaster project was a perfect example of how it took many different organizations coming together.
It's so incredible. The facelift is just so awesome for the residents, and it just will carry the property forward for hopefully the next 30 years. We did all the work over the course of 1 year, updating everything you can think of. We probably touched everything with the property.
We did all new cabinets, and they're modern shaker style with the soft closed doors and drawers.
Yeah, they didn't quite play all the way through, but a lot of good testimonials on that.
rural communities struggle to find proper and adequate housing inventory for their residents and for people that desire to move to their community. This project is successful in adding new inventory that meets the needs of communities like Lancaster.
So the next, excuse me, the next case study here is Prairie House, which is in Sauk City. And this is an example of a private ownership where the partners were aging out and elected to move on, and they sold it to us. We purchased this in 2020. Next slide, please. Again, the sources and uses, we don't have as many layers of lasagna in this one as we did at Lancaster. But again, there's a number of layers. And as Frank mentioned earlier in that testimonial, there are always a number of stakeholders. And the one thing that we have focused on is that one of our most important stakeholders is our residents. And John really didn't explain how difficult it is to get people on board with the move, but when we're done, everybody is extremely happy. Next slide, please.
So here's some before and afters at the Prairie House. You can see the siding was pretty well worn out on the building, starting to become unattached. And the pictures to the right show the new, brighter, lighter look that we're going for. And that the building really has fantastic curb appeal when we're finished. Next slide, Patty. So again, a typical before and after. The kitchen before was one you could barely get in and turn around. Afterwards, a lot of space, nice clean shaker style cabinets again. Next slide, Maddie. So on the left, there's a typical hallway when we're finished. Most of these facilities don't have handrails on both sides of the hallway when we go in, which is an RD requirement. Here we have them on both sides throughout the building. The upper right is a typical laundry area that we'll add in this smaller 8-unit apartment building that there wasn't laundry on the first floor before. Now they have it. And prior to us coming there, the garbage corral was just a cement pad and a dumpster sitting on it. We add a corral around it to make it look a lot nicer and more appealing for everybody, including our neighbors. Next slide, please, Maddie.
Yeah, just to recap, thanks, John. Going back to the beginning, you know, the portfolio is aging, owners are aging. There's a real need for rehab. There's limited resources available. The financial structure is complicated. There are a number of stakeholders. The process is lengthy. It takes a long time. And once you go through the process, you're locking that property up for 30 years of affordability. It's really important upfront that you coordinate and communicate. That's with the residents to get the relocation plan in place. The general contractor needs to be sensitive to in-place rehab where the subcontractors are working around people who are living in the building. They may not be in the specific unit, but they're living in the building. And then also the GC needs to understand the complexities of and requirements of WIDA as far as green built homes and RD. With that, John, I don't know if you have anything else to add. Otherwise, we'll turn it back over to our esteemed MC.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, John. I didn't see any questions. There was a comment in the chat from Tom Hirsch, and Tom mentioned about the capital needs assessment really helping to set up the scope of work for rehab work, both for your investor and for your lenders and such. Maybe you could just expand on that a little bit, Joe, about the CNA process, and is that valuable to you or more to the lender? Or usually investors get their own, don't they?
No, typically the investor will use the CNA that we get, but the comment was absolutely spot on. It serves as a framework to develop your scope of work. There are some nuances to it. WIDA looks at a 15-year analysis period. RD looks at a 20-year analysis period. And because the estimated useful life of some building components typically falls in that 15 to 20-year period. Oftentimes, the CNA that's required by RD will exceed the deposits to a replacement reserve account than WIDA would. WIDA also has a list of approved CNA providers. It behooves you to use one of the approved providers because they know what WIDA is looking for, and a lot of them know what RD is looking for as well. RD will ask for an Excel file so they can manipulate what they need to manipulate for their own purposes, but hire an experienced CNA provider, and Tom's exactly right. It really sets the table, setting the scope of work, and then you can come up with costs with your general contractor.
Great. At one time, I know there was a kind of a push and pull between rural development and investors as far as what should be replaced, what should be rehabbed on 515 projects. The example being that RD would tend to want to go with lower costs and keep things around that maybe had some useful life left, whereas your investor would be looking at replacing everything that you can so you don't have to touch anything in 15 years. They just don't want any problems. Are you still running into that, or has RD come around to being more flexible as far as getting these things rehabbed at a like the investors see it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think both parties have come around. Clearly, from a tax credit investor's perspective, they want everything done because in that 15-year period, they don't want to have any capital needs that are going to come up and bite them. We work closely with Kathy in RD in Wisconsin, and she's phenomenal to work with. She gets it. She understands things. And maybe, John, you could talk a little bit about the pressures that you're facing on the cost side and the lead time. I know you talk about windows and lighting and things like that impact, how much we can afford to spend in this rising cost environment. You give some tips, John?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're trying to close on 2 more properties that we're finding that we either have to cut some scope of work out and get the investors to agree and get RD to agree just to be able to meet the budgets that we have. And everybody knows about lead times right now, but just as one example, I just talked to my person that's supplying my appliances, and they're 8 months out. So in a lot of cases here, we're going to finish a lot of the construction or all of the construction prior to getting those appliances in. So we're going to have to go back to install those. But like Joe said, working with Kathy Zarowski here in Wisconsin, she's great to work with. She understands it. And our investors have also been pretty understanding to know that we've had to change a little bit of our scope of work.
Great, thank you. Hey, Joe, could you talk a bit about your acquisitions and how you find people, how people find you, your territory that you're looking in? Is this Wisconsin only, or are you looking in Illinois, Iowa, border states, Minnesota? Just about your approach there.
Sure. The president of my company would be kicking me under the table. I'd say we'd look anywhere, but really our focus is Wisconsin. We do have management in eastern Iowa, and we own a couple of properties, and we manage some in northern Illinois. So it's really Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and Iowa. As to your question about how we find opportunities, most of the opportunities have come through networking or properties that we currently manage. For example, we're trying to close on 2 properties right now where we manage them, but both of them are owned by local nonprofits. And these local nonprofits were founded about 42 years ago. Yeah. And the people that were initially involved on the board, they're gone. And, might be their son or daughter or somebody who knew them got replaced on the board, but now they're saying, gee, we don't want to own and manage this stuff anymore. We're not capable. The regulations become more and more complicated. So they want out. So on those 2 instances, we're existing managers. They said, what do we do? And we came to them with a solution. And I should also add that both of those groups, and I think this is true for most nonprofit owners, they would like to see the properties preserved. They recognize the need for affordable housing. So, what we've said is we're going to keep it in the program. We're going to rehab it. It's going to be a much better property. And, here we are. We're trying to close 2 of these by the end of the year.
Sure. Are there any size limitations that you just can't go to because they're too small?
Yeah, in order for it to be effective on the tax credit side, Prairie House was 28 units, and that was probably on the small side. Lancaster was unique. It's over 100 units, but the sweet spot's probably 40 to 60, but we can go into the mid 20s. But from a management perspective and from a tax credit perspective, it's difficult to amortize all the costs of a tax credit deal over 20 units versus amortizing it over 40 units. Your legal fees are going to be the same. Your accounting fees are going to be the same. It just makes it more economically viable to have larger units.
Sure. I don't want to put you on the spot, but everybody's had to live through realignment with the USDA for the past year. And it's been a topic of one of our sessions in this fall with USDA. And we had some comments that came from Larry Anderson, a consultant that works nationally last week, his thoughts on realignment and such. But I know it's different, and it's different going forward, and everybody's kind of learning at the same time. But any comments on your experience so far?
Yeah, we had three properties that are part of the new realignment, which occurred in last October 11th, I believe, is when the official realignment date took place. And we had developed a great relationship with Bob Hernandez and Debbie Biga at Stevens Point, their office, and closed a number of deals with them. And then we went to this new process, and it was a learning curve. I will say, though, that once we got to the underwriting portion, and it's a 3-pronged process, there's processing, then it moves from processing to underwriting, from underwriting to closing. Once it got to underwriting, we've had people that are just fantastic. They're working with us. They're working through everything as well. So was it a challenge? Yes. Is it getting better? Heck yeah.
Great. And John, I'm really impressed with your communication that you have with the residents and doing these rehabs. That's sounds like that's a critical piece. I'm curious about the dollars that you're funding for putting them up either in the unit on site that you're rehabbing first, or with family, or in hotels. What are you actually paying for?
So when we put them into a transition unit, really our costs are limited to the TV, internet that we have to put in those transition units, and then the cost to physically move their belongings in and out of their apartment. When they go to a hotel, obviously it changes from just having to provide TV, internet to providing the cost for a hotel room, which is significantly higher. And then we still have the rest of the other costs, moving their belongings in and out, the storage units, the truck rental. And when we send them to family, we give that family a per diem per day to try and cover for the extra expense that family member is causing to them by coming into their home during this transition.
Great. I'll just remind anybody in the audience, if you have a question or comment, to put it in the chat, or Diane and Maddie, if we have the opportunity to unmute folks and let them ask a question. Let me just ask a final question here to Joe, and then we'll wait for any other questions from folks. I'm just curious about your impressions on the WIDA scoring and going into next year. As you know, scoring is the key factor, and I know you pre-score and kind of make a judgment as to whether you're going to be spending $30,000 and have a good chance of getting credits. You don't want to spend that money if you're just going to be way out of the ballpark in scoring. We have a new executive director that will be coming on at WIDA. They seem to have realized that rural housing is pretty important in Wisconsin. I know the Federal Home Loan Bank, with their AHP program, is going to be emphasizing rural housing in their two-state area, Illinois and Wisconsin, next year for their process. So, but any comments on just what YCAR can do, or the folks in the audience that are primarily interested in rural housing can do from the standpoint of advocating for these rural rehabs? It seems like it's a very cost-effective way of saving housing, particularly for very low-income households, as you pointed out, in very small communities. And as you know, they're just not building more of these units in these communities.
Yeah, that's a great question, Russ, and I'll start with your last comment in terms of cost effectiveness. If you look at a typical rehab project, which involves the acquisition of a property and the assumption of RD debt, you know, we can be in there for $150,000 a unit or less. Whereas new construction, LIHTC tax credit property, you know, you're looking at $250,000. From a environmental perspective, by rehabbing a property, you're not using new materials, you're not using up new land per se. I would say that WIDA, through this process with the RD reorganization, has been phenomenal to work with. They gave us extensions on numerous occasions when we had deadlines and we couldn't meet them. And they have worked collaboratively with RD, and RD would explain, here's where they are in the process, and WIDA gave us extra time. So that's been phenomenal. I do have some challenges with how the scoring system works. Certain scoring categories are almost exempt from rural projects. You can't get points for being in a QCT, a qualified census tract. Those are urban tracts. Some of the school districts, the high need, the jobs, some of those points are just not available in rural areas. And, you know, WIDA has buckets of tax credits. There's a general set aside, there's a preservation set aside. They have a rural set aside, a small rural set aside in the 4% credit, state 4% credit, but they don't have that in the 9% credit. And it would be nice if people are willing to advocate to have a rural set aside in the 9% tax credit, because that would give us all a chance to have an even playing field with some of the competitors who are in Madison, or they're in Milwaukee, they're in bigger markets that seem to have a leg up on us when it comes to certain scoring categories.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from the audience? If not, we're coming right up on the hour, and so the slides will be out, the recording will be out shortly on the YCAR website. Feel free to get a hold of Joe or John with any of your specific questions. Very experienced developer, very experienced project manager, and very experienced management company here. So I'm sure they'll be glad to help you and give you some advice. Or work with you if rehabbing your units in the future is in your future. So thanks again, John. Thanks again, Joe. Great presentation. And we'll see everybody from YCAR next year at our annual conference. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.